The Social War was a late Republican struggle between Rome and its Italian allies on the question of inclusion in the Roman state. It is often called the Unnecessary War because it is argued that the Italians never should have had to take up arms and rebel against Rome to earn the civic protections and republican rights to which they were by now surely entitled as integrated members of the Roman state. I've spoken out against this characterization previously, with my opinion being that it betrays a historical bias towards the Romans themselves to regard any effort, violent or not, to assert dignity and autonomy as unnecessary. From the Italian perspective, something real, tangible, and vital for continued existence was at stake. So the social war was very necessary. And it was the Romans who had made it so. The true unnecessary wars of Roman history were the civil conflicts of the imperial era, a bloody stain on the Roman legacy, which reached its fevered height during a decades-long period of rampant civic discord and violence known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century. These civil wars, which permanently fractured the Pax Romana, had no real ideological component. Legion did not square up against legion in efforts to win back old republican rights, to free the slaves, or to elevate the status of women. Rather, the repeated contests that tore apart the Roman world were little more than campaigns to elevate one man to sole dominion, so that he, and he alone, could reward his soldiers. On both sides, the political leanings of the rank and file were more or less uniform. They believed that there should be one emperor, and differences only arose over who that emperor should be. That one-man rule was now more or less the norm in Rome can make it easy to overlook that the city had risen to such great heights under a republican system that invested power in two men, the consuls, who would protect Rome from all foreign threats, but also keep their colleague in check in case he ever showed monarchical ambitions. It seems counterintuitive to us to split power in this manner, but one can hardly argue with the success of the legions during the Republican period, even though its forces were often arrayed against enemies that owed allegiance to a single sovereign. Even during Rome's imperial period, this arrangement resurfaced and functioned effectively during the joint reign of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. Their harmonious rule may even have inspired Septimius Severus to proclaim his sons Caracalla and Geta as co-emperors, though to say that this did not go well would be an understatement. So, in 238, during the revolt against Maximinus, the Senate named two emperors, in hopes that these new rulers would reject the recent tyranny and continued abuse of imperial privilege. To ensure this, they chose two men from their own ranks to be joint emperors, dividing the imperial authority so that the power might not be in one man's hands, and thus plunge them again into autocracy. A fundamental change was clearly needed, and while the Senate was unwilling or unable to even entertain the idea of returning to a republican system, the continued failures of emperor after emperor made some innovation necessary. If insanity is doing the same thing over and expecting different results, we can at least congratulate the Senate on no longer being insane. The two new Augusti were old senators, and very much known quantities within elite Roman circles. Marcus Clodius Pupienus Maximus was an accomplished military man who would be entrusted with the campaign against Maximinus and the defense of the fledgling new order. His colleague was Decimus Caelius Calvinus Balbinus, a legal expert and experienced magistrate. With such divergent backgrounds, the men were an imperial odd couple, and would be poised to butt heads as soon as the immediate crisis dissipated. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. The appointment of joint emperors, each with separate spheres of expertise, has all the hallmarks of a compromise position. But in striking this bargain, the Senate had neglected to consider the opinions of the Roman people. They now voiced their displeasure through the only avenue left to them, a riot. While these actions were being taken on the Capitoline Hill, the people filled the entire street leading up to the Capitol. The huge mob was armed with stones and clubs, for they objected to the Senate's action, and particularly disapproved of Maximus. The prefect ruled the city too strictly for the popular taste, and was very harsh in his dealings with the criminal and reckless elements of the mob. In their fear and dislike of Maximus, they kept shouting threats to kill both emperors, determined that the emperor be chosen from the family of Gordian, and that the title remain in that house and under that name. But as the Senate asserted itself and demonstrated agency for the first time in centuries, the people demanded nothing more than a new imperial overlord, a different head to wear the same crown. The meagerness of their demands are shocking, and they testify to the severe limits of the ideological framework of the Roman masses. This lack of ambition stands in stark contrast to the bravery that they exhibited not just in openly defying the Senate, but even in directly confronting the Praetorian Guard in an armed struggle for the city. After their direct action secured the appointment of Gordian I's grandson to the position of Caesar and junior colleague to the senatorial emperors, a second and more substantial mass mobilization took place against the Praetorian garrison in the city, who were still loyal to Maximus. Thousands of ordinary Romans seized weapons from the armories and aligned with gladiators to place the Praetorian camp under siege. What followed was a bitter battle for the heart of the empire. Recognizing the danger, the despairing Praetorians opened the gate and rushed forth to the attack. A sharp skirmish resulted, and when the mob fled, the guards pursued and drove them into all parts of the city. Bested in the hand-to-hand fighting, the people climbed to the housetops and rained down upon the Praetorians tiles, stones, and clay pots. In this way they inflicted severe injuries upon the soldiers, who, being unfamiliar with the houses, did not dare to climb up after them, and, of course, the doors of the shops and houses were barred. The soldiers did, however, set fire to houses that had wooden balconies, and there were many of this type in the city. Because a great number of houses were made chiefly of wood, the fire spread very rapidly and without a break throughout most of the city. Many men who lost their vast and magnificent properties, valuable for the large incomes they produced and for their expensive decorations, were reduced from wealth to poverty. A great many people died in the fire, unable to escape because the exits had been blocked by the flames. All the property of the wealthy was looted when the criminal and worthless elements in the city joined with the soldiers in plundering, and the part of Rome destroyed by fire was greater in extent than the largest intact city in the empire. We can see that, though the armies of Maximinus and Pupienus were arrayed in northern Italy, the most contentious fighting was occurring in the capital. But just as the Senate and Roman populace seemed to have finally found their resolve, the people of Italy were demonstrating that they were willing to defy not only the toothless Senate or the hated Praetorians, but even the emperor. Upon entering the Italian peninsula to confront the senatorial rebels, Maximinus and his army were denied entry to the city of Aquileia. Though Maximinus was unpopular, this show of resolve by the Aquileians is remarkable. It was easy to complain about taxes and posture against the imperial regime while he was still on the Danube, but when the emperor himself is outside the walls demanding entry to the city and supplies for his army, it takes real courage to turn him away, especially as there were no forces that could conceivably offer relief. The old republican virtues seemed on the verge of reappearing. For the bargain upon which citizen rights had long ago been sacrificed was predicated on continued security and prosperity. In the hierarchical world of the ancient Romans, many were happy to defer to their social superiors on most matters, if they benefited materially from the arrangement. But now, doubt was setting in regarding the ideological consensus that emperors, the army, and the growing bureaucratic state were those best able to lead the empire. The intransigence of Aquileia, however, was more than just a symbolic blow to imperial authority. Maximinus knew the precarity of his situation, and that despite the military weakness of the senatorial party, the longer their rebellion festered in Rome, at the political, economic, and cultural heart of the empire, the weaker he would look, and the greater the likelihood that an ambitious provincial commander, with an actual army, would throw in his lot with the Senate. It was thus critical to put down the revolt as rapidly as possible, so he had initially marched on Rome without making the necessary logistical requisitions to feed his army. He counted on his loyal subjects to supply them. But problems arose when his subjects proved to be less loyal than expected. The strong man responded to this defiance the only way he knew how, through rage and brutality. Unfortunately for Maximinus, the Aquileians were safe behind their walls, and thus beyond his reach, so his anger was directed at his own soldiers, who were suddenly subject to summary execution for even the slightest infraction. Desperately hungry, and laying siege to a city full of their countrymen, whispers of discontent grew ever louder among the legions. Though Maximinus was certainly aware of the precedent of disgruntled soldiers conspiring against the emperor, he must have felt secure in his strength, believing that previous emperors like Pertinax, Elagabalus, and Severus Alexander had all invited the wrath of the Praetorians through weakness, and that a lifelong military man like himself, a veteran and exemplar of the hard virtues of the frontier, had nothing to fear. He was mistaken, and in June 238 Maximinus was assassinated alongside his son by his own soldiers. The death of Maximinus and the failure of his regime illustrates clearly the folly of the outdated idea, popular in some corners of the internet, that strong men create good times, and weakness leads to decay. For what was Maximinus, if not the Platonic ideal of the stalwart strong man, full of duty and resolve? Not just a lifelong soldier, he began his career as a mere enlisted man, and even as an officer remained committed to leading by example and enduring all the same hardships as his men. As emperor, he put the military first, neglecting all other aspects of society to placate the legions. Though his harsh approach to taxation provoked resentment and eventual armed opposition, Maximinus never showed a willingness, let alone an ability, to compromise or secure support for his regime through any method save brute force. He had been all strength and bravado. It had not saved him, nor would it save Rome. The Senate must have believed that their prayers in the Temple of Concord were answered when news reached them that Maximinus's legion had mutinied. With his death, a great reprieve had been granted to the Senate, their unlikely victory in the Civil War achieved primarily through the grit and determination of citizens in Aquileia. All told, it was a relatively bloodless affair, and the empire seemed ready to bounce back without too much disruption. Still without a significant military force to call their own, Pupienus was left with little choice but to pardon Maximinus's soldiers and send them back to their postings on the frontier. In Rome, the Praetorians were quickly forgiven as well, and, naturally, all soldiers received significant donatives, as was custom. Even if the empire could ill afford another excess like this, the emperors knew it was necessary. A new day had dawned in Rome. For the first time in centuries, the Senate had the potential to establish itself as a viable stakeholder in the Roman state, between the army and this new imperial triumvirate.
but the emperors were no longer united by the mutual threat posed by Maximinus. The differences in their outlook stoked divisions that had likely been present long before the two men assumed the purple, and their working relationship quickly deteriorated, with each suspicious that the other was plotting against his life. Assassination and intrigue were the order of the day, after all. Each had had a long and distinguished senatorial career to draw on that should have provided common ground. But when they reflected on the formational experiences of the decades leading up to this point, both Pupienus and Balbinus were not able to look past the friends and peers that had been executed by tyrannical emperors, and they both feared their colleague too much to trust them. They had seen what men were willing to do for absolute power. Why would the other stop now, when there was only one throat left to cut? It so happened that the two men were not in complete accord. So great is the desire for sole rule, and so contrary to the usual practice is it for the sovereignty to be shared, that each undertook to secure the imperial power for himself alone. Balbinus considered himself the more worthy because of his noble birth and his 2 terms as consul. Maximus felt that he deserved first place, because he had served as prefect of Rome and had won a good reputation by his administrative efforts. Both men were led to covet the sole rule because of their distinguished birth, aristocratic lineage, and the size of their families. This rivalry was the basis of their downfall. The two emperors took up residence in different wings of the imperial palace, in a situation not terribly dissimilar from the tragic joint reign of Caracalla and Geta. But their end would not come from one colleague betraying another. Rather, it was their mutual fear and suspicion, a preoccupation with one another resulting in an inability to see beyond their own noses and perceive that the Praetorians were the real threat. This laid the foundations for their undoing. There was dissension, too, between Maximus and Balbinus, unspoken, however, and such as could be surmised rather than seen. For Balbinus scorned Maximus as being humbly born, and Maximus despised Balbinus for a weakling. And this fact gave the soldiers their opportunity, for they knew that emperors at variance could be slain easily. So finally, on the occasion of some scenic plays, when many of the soldiers and palace attendants were busy, and the emperors remained at the palace alone with the German guard, they made a rush at them. When the soldiers thus began to riot, it was announced to Maximus that he could not escape from this disturbance and commotion unless he summoned the Germans, and they, as it happened, were in another part of the palace with Balbinus. He sent to Balbinus accordingly, asking him to send aid. But Balbinus, suspecting that Maximus was asking for the guard to use against himself, since he believed that Maximus desired to rule alone, at first refused and finally began to wrangle over it. And while they were engaged in this dispute, the soldiers came upon them, and, stripping them both of their royal robes, and loading them with insults, they dragged them from the palace. Thence, after handling them roughly, they started to hurry them through the center of the city to the camp. But when they learned that the Germans were following to defend them, they slew them both and left them in the middle of the street. In the meantime, Gordian Caesar was lifted up by the soldiers and hailed emperor, that is, Augustus, there being no one else at hand. And then, jeering at the Senate and people, the soldiers betook themselves immediately to the camp. The senatorial plan to divide imperial authority had worked too well. When it mattered most, the emperors had checked each other, resulting in inaction, and their deaths. Gordian III, just 13 years old, was emperor, in name only. He was now effectively a hostage of the Praetorians. He had not been their first choice, but they were not willing to press their luck by deposing all 3 members of the imperial house, especially since Gordian had such widespread popular support. The situation in the capital was tense, as, despite the success of their plot, the Praetorians knew they could not yet act with total impunity. Though the masses had not planned or executed the coup, the Roman populace theoretically had gotten what it wanted. An heir to the Gordian line was now sole emperor. But that this was ever even a demand speaks to the profound rot that had occurred at Rome's civic heart. Had the masses really expected conditions to change with a new aristocrat on the throne? They had been here before. They had experienced countless flavors of autocrat exercising absolute power over the empire over the past several decades. All had been failures. People had marched in the streets and shed blood to put this boy on the throne. But the truth is that he and his advisors wanted nothing more for the people than any other claimant had. Centuries of monarchy had dimmed the horizons of the Roman political imagination to such an extent that even at its most radical, all the people could demand was that the boot on their necks be worn by a different oppressor, that power be re-centralized instead of redistributed. The fervent populare agitation that had fueled the struggle of the orders and incited the great secessions of the plebs which fractured aristocratic consensus and earned vital tribunician protections was but a distant dream. These instances of sustained direct action had set vital precedents that made the reforms of the Gracchi and the insurgent populism of Caesar possible. Despite the real flaws of these men and their political programs, they are a testament to the vibrant political atmosphere and innovation of the late Republic, when real change wasn't just possible, it was demanded. That hundreds of years later, even in the wildest imaginations of late imperial citizens, none could conceive of reasserting their ancient rights illustrates that the march of history is not linear. Freedom is a constant struggle, and backsliding is always possible. The riots of 238 revealed the contradictions that were at the heart of the empire, how it sought to govern the world, but tensions within its military and political system made it incapable of governing itself. The next 5 decades would betray the insanity of the Roman order, as general after general attempted the same plays for power and governed along the same lines, but, for some reason, always expected different results. For all the disruption and strife, the ideological divide between rich and poor was now superficial at best. Both wanted, in effect, the same system. They just differed over who would be calling the shots at the top. A perverse concord had finally been achieved. A false peace won at the expense of the growth, pragmatism, and dynamism that had made Rome so successful. The best lacked all conviction, while the worst were full of passionate intensity. For the next 50 years, Rome would turn and turn in a widening gyre. The center could not hold, and mere anarchy was loosed upon the world.